Welcome, good evening, everyone. I'm Francesca Ammon, and I'm an associate professor of city planning and historic preservation at the Weitzman School of Design. And on behalf of the entire Department of City and Regional Planning, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's lecture and conversation with historian Lizabeth Cohen. Professor Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History at Harvard. Until 2018, she also served as Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And her scholarship focuses on the 20th century urban, social, cultural, and political history of the United States. She's published numerous articles, a co-authored US history textbook, and 3 major monographs that I want to say a few words about. The first of these, Making a New Deal, examines the everyday choices faced by unionizing Chicagoans in the 1920s and 30s, illuminating the small p politics embedded in the daily activities of work, visiting a movie palace, listening to the radio. In A Consumer's Republic, she considers how mass consumption in the post-war United States particularly transformed the suburbs, spurring the growth of housing and malls, while also revising our conceptions of the public realm. Her most recent book, Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, received the 2020 Bancroft Prize, one of the most prestigious prizes in American history scholarship. Impressively, this was actually the second time that one of her books has earned this honor. And before turning the screen over to her to tell us more about this latest project, I just want to say how personally delighted I am to have Professor Cohen here with us tonight. When I was a graduate student studying in a school of design, she came and spoke about A Consumer's Republic, and it was incredibly affirming for me as someone who's interested in the history of the everyday built environment, to see a place for this kind of historical work in the design fields. And so, I'm thankful to her for being one of a handful of scholars who have really played a critical role for me in that regard. We all need examples to spur us forward and tell us that this is a thing that we're interested in and that it can be valuable and is valued. And so I'm really appreciative of that. And I'm really excited for her to have a chance to share this work with all of us tonight. And lastly, I want to note that Professor Cohen is a deaf storyteller whose scholarship bridges disciplines and shows the resonance of deep historical analysis for addressing contemporary challenges. It was actually an op-ed on affordable housing that she published in the New York Times that caught Professor Vincent Reina's eye. And so together we thought that she would make an ideal speaker for our city planning community here at Penn. So following Professor Cohen's presentation, Professor Reina and I will join her for a conversation about both urban renewal history and affordable housing before opening up the floor to the larger conversation amongst all of us. And on that note, if at any point during tonight's event, please feel free to post a question online. Those will go directly to us, and we'll pose some of those to our speaker after she finishes her prepared comments. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Lizabeth Cohen.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I think I'll share my screen now. Does that seem to be, well, let me make a few introductory remarks and then I will, so before we get more stuff on the screen. I just want to extend some thanks before I start talking. First to Vincent, who actually, when I looked back in my file, I discovered you wrote me in July of 2019 after I had an op-ed in the New York Times. And of course to Francesca for helping to get this evening together, and to both of you for participating in our discussion to come. You've both done important work in related areas, and I'm particularly interested in how you might relate some of the points that I make to the Philadelphia story. I also want to thank some members of the Department of City and Regional Planning, Professor Lisa Servin, early on when I was going to come in person, was involved, and Kate Daniel has been very supportive throughout in organizing the event. And thanks to all of you in the audience for coming tonight. As I said, as you heard, that we first started discussing this in July 2019, and then I was supposed to come in person in April of 2020. Obviously, I did not. But here we are in November in 2020, and I wish I were there in person. But I think, as you will hear, that the issues that we're going to be discussing tonight are as important, if not more important, today than they were when I was going to speak last April. So let me share my screen. Just find the slideshow. Okay, does that look all right? You're all muted. Can you just show me?
Looks good.
Yeah, okay, great. So I imagine that you're here as I am because we share a concern with cities and how they are faring. I know that even before COVID hit, I was very worried about the state of American cities. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. I was worried about the growing gap between haves and have-nots, about the crisis in affordable housing, in the failing infrastructure like mass transit, and the struggle that many cities face to make it with very little federal assistance and great dependence on the private sector. And I hoped in writing this book that I might understand better how we got to the place that we're in these years after World War II. This book was a departure for me, as you got a sense of, I think, from Francesca's introduction. My previous work had probed the experiences of large groups of ordinary Americans. For this book, I decided it made most sense to focus on the career of an individual who had power, who was deeply engaged in post-war urban redevelopment. And Edward J. Logue emerged as an ideal guide, given that he had a long career and that he worked in multiple cities. And I was delighted to discover that he had left a large cache of his papers at his alma mater of Yale. Historians need documents, and so that was key. And also that even though he was no longer alive, that he had given many interviews during his career and that I had access to that. So I could really hear his voice, even if I couldn't hear it in reality. So this book is part biography, part using Logue as a vehicle to a larger story about post-war American cities. And I should say that Logue himself turned out to be quite a fascinating figure, very complex, loved and admired by some and deeply disliked by others. One of the reasons that this subject attracted me was that I thought we had much too simplistic a picture of how post-World War II cities developed in response to the enormous competition they faced from booming suburbs. We tended to reduce everything to one long Manichaean struggle between a villainous, bulldozing Robert Moses and a more saint-like Jane Jacobs, with her message of anti-planning, hands-off, let neighborhoods and cities develop organically on their own. Surely, I thought, the story must be more complicated than these two extreme positions. Now, I certainly recognized that urban renewal, as it is often referred to broadly, from the late 1940s into the 1970s, had serious flaws. Excessive demolition and dislocation of residents, highways slashing through still viable neighborhoods, and misguided introductions of suburban-oriented schemes like shopping centers plopped into urban downtowns. But I also knew that many cities were in very deep trouble by the 1940s, after the long Great Depression, then the war, and now this massive exit starting in the 1940s of people and capital to the suburbs. I wondered, was urban renewal such an unchanging disaster from the Housing Act of 1949, which actually had promised to provide, and I quote, a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, end quote, through the 1970s? Or did it evolve over time as city officials and planners learned some lessons on the job and adapted to changes in policy and politics over time? In time, I would discover that Logue's career in urban redevelopment, in fact, tracked remarkably well with shifts in approaches, distinct phases and strategies of urban redevelopment over a half century. And I also learned that there were some surprisingly progressive dimensions to what someone like Logue was doing, such as seeking socioeconomic diversity in communities, federal support for cities and affordable housing, and metropolitan engagements in solving a city's problems. So I'm going to give you now a very brief summary of Logue's life and career in 5 acts, and then suggest some of the things that are useful for us to think about today. If you want more detail and more analysis, as you might, you'll just have to read the book. So let's start with Act 1, Logue's early life. Logue actually grew up in your backyard in Philadelphia, and he went to Yale College on scholarship. He came from a very modest family, and Yale Law School on the GI Bill. At Yale, Logue became deeply involved with New Haven and its working class residents, helping to organize Yale workers in their first labor union and training as a labor lawyer. He fought McCarthyism and discriminatory quotas at Yale, and he became actively engaged in civil rights. In short, Logue's later commitment to renewing cities very much grew out of his liberal progressive politics, which runs counter to many assumptions we make about that urban renewers were always part of a pro-business growth machine that put corporate profits over people. Logue thought that the problems of American cities should be the next frontier of FDR's New Deal, and that extensive federal dollars and expert know-how should be applied to the challenge of saving America's cities. Another important early influence on Logue was the time he spent in India during the early 1950s, working with Ambassador Chester Bowles. Logue here observed the US government and the Ford Foundation organizing what was called at the time community development. And this meant making improvements in the physical infrastructure of houses, of wells, of schools, and so forth, in hopes of creating a more equal, more democratic, and I remind you, this is the Cold War, anti-communist India. Logue thus took to heart, and he brought back with him to the United States, the message that physical improvements could bring about social and political change. Act 2, New Haven, 1954 to 1961. Logue's first major job in renewing cities was back in New Haven. Here he teamed up with newly elected Reform Democratic Mayor Richard C. Lee, who you see here in the picture, to turn around a city that was in very big trouble. Factories were closing, good working class jobs were therefore disappearing. African Americans were arriving from the South in hopes of making a better living in the North, while middle class whites were fleeing the city for the suburbs. And I-95 was being planned to bypass the city, which was a death knell to New Haven's position as the region's retail center. Logue and Lee felt they had to do something, and I try to understand how they saw the situation as New Deal liberals and racial progressives in their own time. They aggressively took advantage of newly available funds from the federal government's Housing Acts of 1949 and then revised in 1954, with the goal of making New Haven a national laboratory of urban renewal, physically, as well as with social programs. And many of the programs they implemented, like Head Start, were later incorporated into LBJ's Great Society. Lee and Logue had some notable successes, but overall, this first phase of federal urban renewal during the 1950s was problematic. Too much demolition, too much displacement to build new housing with the futile hope of keeping the middle class in the city, and too top-down, even though they felt that they were being democratically minded experts when they consulted with the leaders of established community groups. And I call their approach to consultation pluralist democracy. Moreover, to tie downtown to the new I-95, they constructed a connector, which you can see in the photograph, and then replaced the heart of downtown New Haven with a suburban style, car-oriented shopping center. And that too is visible in the photograph. Act 3, Boston, 1960 to 1967. Logue was recruited to Boston to head a much expanded Boston Redevelopment Authority, which was known as the BRA, by another new mayor, this time John Collins, and he's the man in the wheelchair. He had survived polio. And take note that Cardinal Cushing is also in this image because the Catholic Church was extremely engaged and committed to urban renewal in Boston. And Collins's top priority when he took office was turning around his near bankrupt, physically deteriorating, and politically paralyzed city. Boston had experienced its own disastrous first phase of urban renewal in the 1950s with the destruction of the immigrant West End neighborhood. Recognizing the anger that that demolition and that project had provoked, and having learned some lessons from New Haven, Logue came in promising to do things differently, waving a flag of planning with people. I examined two major dimensions of Logue's Boston urban renewal work: downtown and the neighborhoods. In downtown, Logue used federal dollars and, very importantly, the physical presence of government and through its offices to create a new government center to revitalize Boston's stagnant downtown, and also to create more jobs and to pressure the recalcitrant Yankee business elite to start investing in Boston rather than everywhere else but Boston, which was their habit. Here also, Logue came to recognize the importance of integrating historic buildings with modern ones, creating a mix that I think still characterizes Boston today. And what you see on the left is the Sears block right next to the new Boston City Hall. And then on the right, Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall, which eventually under the next mayor, White, became the first festival marketplace. Then I look at 5 Boston neighborhoods: Roxbury's Washington Park and Madison Park neighborhoods, Charlestown, the South End, and the North Harvard Street area of Allston. And in general, urban renewal in Boston's neighborhoods was much more contentious than downtown. But I discovered that every neighborhood had its own dynamic and that the story could not easily be reduced to the frequent assumption that we make that it's always about middle-class whites pushing lower-class Blacks out of their neighborhoods. In fact, in Roxbury's Washington Park neighborhood, the Black middle class welcomed the urban renewers with open arms, as they had very few options for where they could buy homes in Boston. And they wanted the city's help. They demanded the city's help, in fact, to help revitalize their community. I also argue that over Logue's Boston years, neighborhood residents learned to negotiate with city officials, and as a result, they got more affordable housing, and they would, in the 1970s, defeat 2 major highway projects. In short, Logue learned to adapt to a new expectation for community engagement that emerged during the 1960s. In contrast to that pluralist democracy that I mentioned of the 1950s, this era marked the emergence of what I call participatory democracy, as it required much more grassroots participation in urban redevelopment, as well as in many other social movements: civil rights, anti-war, second wave feminism, and the list goes on. I want to show you now one of my favorite photographs, which is of protesters in the North Harvard area of Allston. And what's interesting about this one community is that the BRA, in fact, did not negotiate very well with this neighborhood. And when Logue went later, after he'd finished his sort of major jobs and tried to write a memoir, which he did not get very far on, he made a list of his greatest mistakes, his greatest regrets. And number 1 on the list was not negotiating with the North Harvard neighborhood. Logue resigned from the BRA in the summer of 1967 to run unsuccessfully for mayor. It was a field of 10 candidates. He came in 4th. This was the election that Louise Day Hicks was running in as the kind of segregationist candidate. And so the opponents really rallied around Kevin White. But notably, the one precinct that he won outright included Washington Park. It was his reward for working with that neighborhood on its renewal. Let me say now, we'll turn to Act 4, New York State, 1968 to 1975. It wasn't clear what would come next for Logue until liberal Republican governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller, who you see in the center of both of those images, hired Logue to head a new experimental and powerful statewide urban renewal agency. It was called the New York Urban Development Corporation, known as the UDC. Rockefeller had become frustrated with the difficulty of getting New York State's voters to pass the bond issues that were required by the state's constitution to build much needed subsidized housing. So the UDC was his ambitious workaround to be funded with a combination of state and federal funding to the extent that it still existed by the late 60s, and in a unique move, the sale of bonds to private investors. Rockefeller gave the UDC enormous powers, and most controversial of those powers was the ability to override exclusionary local zoning. And that exclusionary local zoning was crucial then and continues today in many places to be an obstacle to building affordable housing. And he recognized the difficulties that the UDC would have and therefore gave it those powers. But it meant he had to really push hard to ram this through the New York State legislature, which was very resistant, as you can imagine, to having communities give up those powers, have them be the potential to be overridden. And he managed to do this as a tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. right after his assassination. The UDC had many successes in its 6.5-year life. It built 33,000 units of housing, which was subsidized all over the state. And it did seek alternatives to the demolition style urban renewal, in particular by building 3 new towns. 2 of them were on undeveloped land in upstate New York, and the third was Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York City. And the UDC deliberately planned these 3 new towns to be mixed income, mixed race, and mixed age communities. UDC also experimented with innovative architectural design and technology. They had top architects working with them, and it became a leader in affirmative action hiring in the state. But the UDC came tumbling down when Logue tried to build modest amounts of subsidized housing in 9 well-off Westchester suburban communities. And he called this program the Fair Share Housing Program. Logue had long tried to solve urban problems with metropolitan solutions. He tried that in New Haven, tried it in Boston, couldn't get anything to happen. And he thought that finally, with his statewide authority at the UDC, he'd be able to pull it off. Well, he quickly learned that was not going to be. He was met with enormous pushback, including the removal of these zoning override powers that the UDC had originally been given. And you can see, this is a photograph is from Bedford, New York. You can see in it, I think, how popular the UDC plan for fair share housing was. This problem was accompanied by another one, President Nixon's decision to impose a moratorium on all spending on housing as part of his new federalist agenda to reduce the role of the federal government. The result of the convergence of these factors was the total collapse of the UDC. And this was cheered on by bankers who argued that the UDC was actually putting a social mission before its responsibility to investors. With a major default on bonds looming, Logue was forced to resign, which he did in great anger and frustration. His final act, Act 5, the South Bronx, 1978 to 1985. Logue's last major urban redevelopment job was as president of a very small, scrappy organization, the South Bronx Development Organization, known as the SBDO. Here, Logue sought to rehabilitate himself after the spectacular failure of the UDC, while he also worked to rehabilitate one of the poorest areas of the nation. and he had at his disposal weaker powers, fewer tools, and less funding than he had ever had before. Nixon's cuts in appropriations had continued under President Carter, and they took an even bigger dive under President Reagan. Between 1981 and 1987, federal housing programs were slashed by 2/3, more than any other part of Reagan's budget. The federal government was clearly going out of the business of urban redevelopment and instead providing private market solutions. And that's pretty much the reality we live with today. In the South Bronx, Logue sought ways of working within this new regime. His best known SBDO project was Charlotte Gardens, which involved constructing 90 ranch-style, prefabricated, single-family homes constructed on the rubble of Charlotte Street. Houses were heavily subsidized for purchase, with the goal of attracting lower middle-class homeowners to stabilize the community. And then the idea was that multifamily rental housing would likely follow. To the surprise of many skeptics, Charlotte Gardens proved a huge success, with hundreds of Black and Puerto Rican Bronx residents, and they were transit workers, security guards, police, firefighters, nurses, teachers, eager to buy the kinds of homes they either couldn't afford or felt were not available to them as people of color in New York City's lily-white suburbs. Moreover, Charlotte Gardens and other SBDO housing provided a blueprint for the much more extensive 10-year Koch housing plan that followed, which in fact added hundreds of thousands of units to New York City's housing stock. Most notably, after paying lip service, you could say, for many years to his mantra of planning with people, it was here in the South Bronx where Logue actually did it. And he worked very closely with community planning boards and with a CDC like the Mid-Bronx Desperados, which became his partner in Charlotte Gardens. And you can see Genevieve Brooks, who headed that in the bottom picture. He had come to recognize how crucial community involvement was to a project's success. In conclusion, let me suggest some takeaways from my book, many of which I think continue to challenge us today. First, I would argue that Logue's story reveals that urban renewal was not the one huge, unchanging disaster of popular lore with no lessons learned over time, but actually a much more complex evolutionary response to American cities in crisis, where renewers like Logue experimented with different approaches as a result of their own admitted failures, as well as shifts in national policies. Even if we acknowledge that urban renewal was the proverbial mixed bag, I think we can still aspire to recapture that spirit of commitment and in particular experimentation that propelled people like Logue, rather than content ourselves with accepting the limited palette of possibilities that has come to dominate since the 1980s. And maybe under a new administration, we'll have a chance to do that. Second, Logue long struggled over balancing the public planner's expertise with the role that residents must play in decisions affecting their neighborhoods. Finding that balance, I think, still proves a challenge today. As community involvement has fortunately become a given, we nonetheless have to worry about how to avoid NIMBYism and too narrow a focus on one small corner of a city without considering the city as a whole. Third, Logue had a lifelong commitment to creating socially diverse communities that were mixed by income, by race, and by age. He felt that this was the best insurance that low and moderate income Americans, who are often minorities, would get access to the decent schools and services that middle-class whites often demanded. But he struggled with how to do this. And I think today, this is still a challenge. In an environment of great dependence on private market solutions, it's not easy to keep existing residents in gentrifying neighborhoods. It's not easy to provide sufficient numbers of Section 8 vouchers for low-income people who want to move to better served communities. It's not easy to maintain the public housing that is still desired by thousands of Americans who wait on long lists. And it's not easy to scale up the affordable units that developers in many cities are required to include or help to fund in other locations when they get approval for market rate projects. Fourth, another hard nut for Logue to crack was how to involve whole metropolitan areas in solving the housing, the schooling, and the other problems that low-income city residents faced. After failing efforts in New Haven and Boston, Logue hoped that his statewide perch at the UDC would make it possible. But instead, as I told you, it led to his and the UDC's downfall. And I think that this difficulty of metropolitan planning remains with us. And finally, Logue's greatest disappointment was a decline in the role and responsibility of government, particularly at the federal level, for financing the revitalizing of cities and the subsidizing of affordable housing. Over his career, Logue watched federal subsidies steadily shrink and responsibility shift to the private sector, which he considered a huge mistake. And today, too often, I think cities are forced to squeeze the private sector for resources, making deals with developers and corporations like Amazon that in the end cost them in future tax revenues, uncompensated burdens on public services, and races to the bottom with other cities where in the end, all the competitors lose out. I'll close on quoting the last lines of my book. A better understanding of this history will hopefully reawaken from a long slumber the will and wherewithal to revitalize cities that still struggle with economic survival, to invest in neighborhoods still lacking adequate services, and to improve the prospects for those Americans still poorly housed or in the worst cases, homeless. This would be the legacy of urban renewal that Ed Logue would want us to honor, and that he would consider the highest tribute we could pay to his lifetime of public service, imperfections and all. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That was great overview of it's a big book, everybody. So she covered a lot in a short amount of time, and I recommend that you dig in and hear some of the detailed stories behind this as well. At this point in the program, I'm gonna introduce my colleague Vincent Reina, and he and I will chat with Professor Cohen a bit and kind of relate some of the stories that she discussed to what we know here in Philadelphia, both in the history of urban renewal and in terms of housing. And then we'll invite questions from the audience. So feel free to post questions in the Q&A as we're getting this going. Vincent Reina is an assistant professor of city and regional planning here at Penn. He studies urban economics, low-income housing policy, household mobility, neighborhood change, and community and economic development. He's published numerous journal articles, as well as consulted on the development of housing plans here in Philadelphia and around the country. And most recently, he's co-edited the volume Perspectives on Fair Housing, following the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. So together, we'd just like to engage in some conversation. Liz, your book, raises to the fore the story of Ed Logue alongside Robert Moses and Ed Bacon, and thinking about we could lump them all together on the one hand, these big, powerful actors who led big renewal programs, but of course they're different. And Greg Heller makes the argument that Bacon was really more of the designer. Not that he came up with the ideas, but he was much more invested in the design. He did a lot more of the promoting of big visionary approaches to the city, and whereas Moses and Logue were much more of kind of the implementers. That was their great skill, implementing these kind of public-private plans and getting things done. And I just wondered what you thought about that. How would, not to necessarily go deep on any of the others, but how would you situate Logue in terms of how he was able to achieve what he achieved, and what does he tell us kind of about the role of the post-war planner?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I want to pick up on this issue of Bacon, the designer. Where was Logue on the subject of what this should actually look like, which you were implying? And it's interesting because he learned over time, I think, to actually care a lot about architecture. In the New Haven, and I write a fair amount about this in the book, in New Haven, they just wanted modern buildings that would signal that New Haven was progressive and that it was looking to the future, not buried in the past. And then when some of those first buildings went up, along the connector was the first one, they were pretty disappointed with what they looked like. And so by the time he got to Boston, he started to take architecture a lot more seriously. And he appointed a design advisory board made up of the deans of MIT and the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and including some major architects in the city. And he became extremely interested in architecture and in fact, what these spaces would look like. But the way I would distinguish his interest in architecture from somebody who was very much focused, and this may be the case for Bacon, on what it would look like, is that for Logue, the design always came after the social agenda. That he was, and that is what allowed him, to his real disappointment actually, to move from the UDC, where he was ecstatic to hire, both well-established and young and up-and-coming architects to experiment with building subsidized housing that really worked for people, that was affordable, blah, 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 to, Charlotte Gardens, which is, so undistinguished. And in fact, some of the people that he worked closely with at the UDC, the architects, were just so horrified at the look of Charlotte Gardens, they could barely even come and look at it. But for Logue, he kind of held his nose. He said, "I regret not getting the awards that I once got." But he was trying to figure out what would work given the political and economic environment he found himself in, where he had to take advantage of programs that were aimed at private market solutions, home owning, subsidizing the home purchasing rather than building rental housing and so forth. As well as, to be honest, he also recognized if this was going to work, if these houses were going to function as anchors for the rebuilding of this community, they had to appeal to the people who lived there. And he had an inkling that this was the kind of house that would actually work for them. And in fact, it turned out to be true. So I do think it's interesting. I'll just say one more thing about Logue versus Moses. They knew each other a little bit. They both were New Haveners to some extent. Both had gone to Yale. They would meet up a couple times a year at Yale football games, whether it was at Yale or Princeton. But Logue really considered Moses to be very different in his agenda than himself. And again, he felt that he had much more of a social commitment than Moses did. He admired some of the parks, and to be honest, Logue also was not opposed to highways, so he didn't mind some of the highways that Moses built. It was the housing and what he did to neighborhoods that, really was unacceptable to him.
That's helpful. I think all three of them love the highways. I think it's fair to say.
Oh, Bacon too, huh? Even
yeah. Another kind of thinking through some similarities I see when looking at Philadelphia and what Logue did. If there were two, and this is a very selfish question because I'm interested in the way that rehabilitation and preservation related to urban renewal. But Worcester Square and Society Hill were kind of the canonical early rehabilitation-based projects of urban renewal. And I was surprised you have a wonderful quote from Logue in the book that he talked about how what they were doing in Worcester Square allowed them, you said, to rebuild a neighborhood with a scalpel and not a bulldozer, which is a really similar quote to what Architectural Forum said about what Bacon was doing in Philadelphia, which described him as curing slums with penicillin, not surgery. So, all these metaphors, but it's a very similar comparison. But in reading and hearing you describe, it seems to me that he was maybe kind of a reluctant preservationist, or what? How did he did it because people pushed him to, with regard to government center, and how did he think about preservation? And does his experience offer us any insights to the relationship between preservation and revitalization?
Well, I guess I'd say a few things about that. One is that Worcester Square, and for the audience may not know what that is, that was one of the last projects that Logue was involved with in New Haven, and it involved the Italian neighborhood in New Haven. And the important point that it's a complicated story, which I do talk about in the book, but I think one of the important points we can take from this is that the way it matters how the federal legislation and regulations are written. So for the 50s, this disastrous sort of leveling and bulldozing was actually the only way that cities could get the federal dollars. That was expected, and it only led to the doing of that. By 1954, that was in the 49 Act. By 1954, and it takes a while for these things to get into motion, it became permissible to use federal dollars for rehabilitation, not just for demolition. So it's just an example of they really didn't have the ability to do that earlier. And then it was a kind of a crucial moment for Logue in recognizing that there were real benefits. So, there were also downsides in that, you're in a situation like Worcester Square, you're ending up then giving resources to homeowners. Renters are often losing their homes because they're, kind of pushed out. The rents may become too expensive. So he was aware of some of the pros and cons of the situation. And then I think he, coming to recognize that there should be a kind of mixed landscape of both historic and just existing buildings and new buildings was something that took him a while to figure out. And I think in Boston is where I think he really learned this, because there was a preservationist activism there. And when Government Center went in, and the original plan, which was done by I.M. Pei, had that Sears Crescent, Sears block coming down, there was such an outcry that, he really learned, and he became a real advocate for saving that block. Now, you could argue that it was a kind of museum piece, sort of juxtaposed there to this kind of modernist government center. But then, he also recognized that though there were many people who thought the Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall, not so much Faneuil Hall, that probably would have remained, but Quincy Market was crumbling and a disaster. There were many people who said we should level this, and he and others in the BRA said, no, we really need to keep it, and then maybe someday it will be rehabilitated. And in fact, that happened, though under, as I said, the next mayor. So I think he came to recognize the importance of these juxtapositions. I think he was never willing to completely give up on the importance of building new. But there's a very interesting event that he participated in, at MoMA, that I mentioned in the book, where he said, I've kind of become a preservationist. I don't think it should be exclusively the only way we work. And here I do think, to give him some credit, he, recognized the cost of, in some cases, preservation that led to gentrification. And he did have an eye on, the necessity of building subsidized housing, so that I have a correspondence I quote in the book where he's trying to get some developers interested in the South End. And already the Prudential Center was pretty far along, and there was such a good housing stock in the South End, he could see gentrification happening. And he said, if we don't get some publicly funded projects in here soon, we'll never get them. And there won't be the kind of mix of population that we're striving for.
Thanks. He's an interesting case in a person changing their perspectives too over time, which is fascinating.
There are ways in which, people, he really did change. And that's one of the things that I do chart over the book. Right. But of course, there are ways in which in the South Bronx, there were moments when Genevieve Brooks, would call him out on acting like he was still running the UDC and a big boss. and not listening well enough to people in the neighborhood. You know, I mean, it's not so easy for people to change, particularly somebody of his ilk, but I do think he did.
That's actually forays a little bit into one of my thinkings. And so I would say I was particularly interested in kind of reading and learning more about that piece of things because I worked at a CDFI called LISC for a while that
Yeah.
came out of the South Bronx work. And I actually directly worked with the Mid-Bronx Desperados, a community development corporation in the Bronx, underwriting loans for them, providing technical assistance and all those things. So it was interesting to kind of see that connection. And one thing that really struck me though is what you see is this kind of movement from resources with a lot of social controls and top-down perspective about the way things are being done, kind of tied to those resources. And then when those resources are totally lost, it's almost like he finds the importance of engagement, right? Because there then lies kind of almost the power. You don't have the dollars, so you need the engagement and the in the community to actually give you that power to create leverage, to create resources, to push back against the private sector, to leverage the private sector in the correct way. And it really struck me, right? Because on one hand, we clearly need kind of a massive investment in housing right now. But you could almost see from this example the fact that the lack of resources actually forced him to realize the importance of engagement. So as planners, like, does that kind of perennially put the planner in a funny spot, right? Right? Where as soon as that maybe they get the resources, the value of engagement diminishes, the ability to exploit those kind of larger top-down social control approach to planning might kind of come out a little more. And how do we think of that in our current
Well,
context?
I mean, it's obviously a really crucial issue, and you know, were there ever to be more public resources, maybe we would face you know, more of the dilemma again. And you know, and there are many positive aspects and, you know, crucial aspects to community involvement, but we do see also it running rampant in NIMBYism in some cases. So that, you know, in a city, a metropolitan area like Boston, you can't get these suburban communities, you know, they run, you know, screaming and kicking against it to build affordable housing. You know, because, and they have a, you know, it's like that Bedford case, you know, if you believe in community decision making, that community might decide they don't want that. You know, so it is a complicated picture, you know, how to balance some vision of not just top-down expertise that's insensitive, but also the greater good. You know, when you've got, you know, we live in a world where property values are crucial to people. They protect them, you know, to the end. So, you know, these are difficult situations. I just hope that if there were to be more resources coming to support more Section 8 vouchers, to build more subsidized housing, to provide more incentives, I would hope that we would bring to that process a recognition of what has been learned over these many decades, though, about the necessity of engaging people and having a real public process. Just the way I argued that there were changes that took place from, you know, 1949 to 2000, I think, you know, there continue to be, you know, that it will continue to change, and it's possible to have more resources coming from the top and still have a kind of an open process. I would hope so anyway.
Mhm.
I mean, you're working in this field. Do you
Yeah.
think it's possible?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that, and in hearing like your talk and reading your op-ed and everything else is really interesting to think of even like the power of so many federal tools that were in place and how they were in many ways used and employed to invest in white individuals and white households and white neighborhoods for a very long time, right? And now we need to see that same level of investment for non-white households, for cities broadly, but particularly for non-white households who never received, and non-white communities that never received that kind of massive form of investment. And so when you say that, it makes me think of a lot of the recent movements around under the Obama administration, under affirmatively furthering fair housing planning efforts, right? Where there was actually a tie of federal dollars to say, you not only have to show how you're just trying to stop discrimination, you have to actually show how you're affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? You have to create a plan that shows how you're going to that next step, how you're going to use these kind of federal investments to make massive change, and how you're going to actually engage communities in this effort. And that's one thing actually Philadelphia did quite well. They did extensive surveying, they did focus groups. It was just this kind of massive planning effort that really built on a lot of local planning initiatives that existed already and amplified those, but also kind of developed new methods and models for really thinking about this. So as we think of this federal infusion, in some ways, the role of the federal government in acknowledging the role of planning seems to be something you're pulling out, and particularly community engagement in that, and have that be a part of the solution in these programs, right? That they have to be tied to these kind of broader planning efforts and initiatives that squarely acknowledge the importance, but also the challenges and limitations of community engagement.
Yeah, I couldn't, you said it beautifully. And I think we have a perfect example, not that, Obama, I don't know how successful they were in a short period of time in enforcing some of those regulations. Of course, under Trump, forget it, nothing has happened at all. But I totally agree with that. And one of the things I'm really trying to do here is I don't, of course, disagree with the critique that so much federal power and money and went into privileging whites. I don't at all want what I'm saying to be taken as the federal government never did any wrong. But what worries me is that the critique of that can serve to undermine any pressure to get federal dollars back into the game. And there's in the end, it would just reinforce the private sector reality that we live with today and take the pressure off. I mean, federal dollars alone don't do it. They have to be incentivized, and implemented in the right way. That is a political process we have to keep working on. But I don't want to let the federal government off the hook, because I don't think that cities and states have the ability to put the money into solving these problems that the federal government does. They have to balance their budgets. They have a lot of other political issues to deal with. I just don't, and municipalities, of course, don't have to contend with anybody but their own voters. So there's so many ways in which if this is operating on too low a local level, we're not going to see the change we need to see. So I just want, but it takes understanding that I am not trying to endorse redlining or all of the ways that that the federal government did do things that were damaging. But we need to be able to make those distinctions.
Well, yeah, in the city of Philadelphia, with the close to 26% poverty rate, the amount of resources needed to make housing affordable to those households, which we need, far exceeds anything the city of Philadelphia could do on its own. And there is an absolute need, essential need for federal support in those settings.
And I'll just point to another dimension of this that I just mentioned very quickly in passing that is pretty upsetting, is the state of public housing, which many you can say, oh, disastrous, all those tall towers, but it's okay if tall towers are condos that wealthy people want to live in with great views. A lot of people see that there's potential there for very decent housing. And, in fact, the early public housing that was built in the 30s was low scale, garden apartments kinds of housing. But the inability of most cities to maintain public housing has been just disastrous. And it's criminal. And, again, there's no way that those city housing agencies are going to be able to come up with the millions and billions it's going to take to do that.
Yeah, no, and that's it. And I see there's a question here, but I want to just react to that to say, and it is amazing because you create a system that's made to fail, right? When you're funding public housing 85 cents on the dollar for their operating costs, that's only so long you can survive like that, right? And that's what we did, is we underfunded this housing for long enough that we doomed it to fail, right? In many ways. And then we say, oh, look, public housing doesn't work. Well, I mean, it wasn't funded adequately. So we don't know if it actually, right? And in many ways there's evidence that it did work very well. And so that's exactly right. Francesca, I know that you're looking at the questions as they come in. Did you?
Actually, our conversation has really shifted to cover some of this ground. And I wanted to chime in that, absolutely, what makes the urban renewal era so interesting to me is the immense amount of money that was available to actually implement ideas. But unfortunately, there was these restrictions that you had to demolish, right? And how different would it have been if that hadn't been the requirement at first, or the opposite of that had been the requirement. But then we know that not demolishing doesn't mean that people don't get displaced either, right? Because of gentrification. So there's all these things. So maybe combining some of the questions that we have here, one is just about that we're well removed from this post-war era of the stupor of hyper competence, and how do we actually recenter or center non-white, non-male perspectives in terms of how to plan today. And the question from Ebony Hawkins really asks about planning and planning education too. Like, how do we actually realize this different way of thinking, but still, I would say, maintain the ability to get things done and have an impact, but without doing it in that same kind of way.
Well, I'd like to hear, what you two have to say. You're involved in educating planners. I think it's, there's been a real kind of identity crisis, I think, as an outsider in planning from, the 1960s on. And I don't know where it is today. Certainly a recognition of, the top-down way that this all urban renewal began is not acceptable at all. But then we've just been talking about all of the challenges that come with just, opening it up to, whoever can rally enough people to come to a public meeting. That's not an answer either. So balancing some expertise with community engagement and figuring out how to get as many voices to the table. So it's not just those who I've seen studies in Massachusetts of the people who show up at public meetings, they tend to be older, whiter, wealthier, there's a complexity there too. So, how to carve out the right role is something I would be very interested to know, how you are training young planners to think of themselves and the roles they'll play.
I mean, so one thing that strikes me as clear here, and and I think our department is trying to make strides in this way, but we're definitely not even close to there, is just to acknowledge how much of our pedagogy is rooted in whiteness, right? And so from the theories to the way they're implemented, the authors and who we're citing, the perspectives that we're even bringing into how we teach planning, no less than implement planning, right? And so I do think there's a moment where really a lot of even the kind of core texts of planning and how white and male they are on full display, right? And this has been known for many people for some time, but I think the field itself is having a moment of, I would hope, a moment of reckoning to figure out how to or push to how to change that, to acknowledge that part of it starts in how we teach planning and planners, but a lot of that involves in then how we actually employ these planning tools or don't employ tools at all that have been employed for some time. And so really kind of thinking of that across the whole spectrum of planning happening kind of throughout the life cycle. So sorry, I know I'll let you go from there, Francesca.
I just wanted to add, I think, it's interesting to think about this in terms of scale. And you make this point, Liz, that, we can't just look at Logue overall. We need to look at the neighborhoods and what happened in the individual neighborhoods. As we break these things down, we see how complicated things are and the roles that lots of different people played besides just the lead planner too, and how these collaborations are really important. And then you see neighborhood level actors of diverse races playing a really important role. And so the fact that, Logue was this implementer, maybe that's a good role as long as it's being influenced by the right voices on the ground. And I think in terms of scale, there are other great examples that we need to look to. And your own student, Brian Goldstein, right, who has written about this in Harlem, The Roots of Urban Renaissance, and is writing now a biography of Max Bond, who did this kind of community level work too. He's an African-American architect and really had different ways of doing things, thought about rehabilitation in a way that allowed people to stay too. So I think we need to, teach more stories. And I think getting down to that scale too, look at the big names, but then see what they did in the small scale and see what other people were doing at small scale, because these are the things that are going to apply to most places too, right? Which are smaller. Cities are smaller than New York and Boston and Philadelphia, but it's at the neighborhood level. And I see a lot of student interest thinking about that scale too. And I think that's a very practical way to think about it.
Well, I think that's great, because I think I tried to close on this point that, what if we can just get back and this requires having some cooperation, I think, with the people who have money to spend, but we need to be much more open to thinking of new solutions to things, being much, as I said, be more experimental about it. I mean, we seem pretty stuck in strategies that have been around for a pretty long time. And many of them, I mean, here's where, I kind of shared Logue's concerns about so many of them being dependent on private sector willingness. So low-income tax credits, for example, that really depend on corporations needing and wanting to get tax credits. It's not a very dependable source of resources to build housing, or Section 8 vouchers that depend on a landlord being willing to accept them. I mean, you could just go on and on with, what were our tools today. We need some more. And I think probably also in this process dimension also, some new ways of both bringing sort of the latest thinking and knowledge of about technology. I mean, why are we still building the way we build? Can we not apply some of the technological know-how to building at the scale of subsidized housing that we need? So, I think I'd like to see that we think outside it's a cliche, thinking outside the box, but we really are stuck in there.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time, but I think I want to pose one more question from the chat. Claudia Aiken asked about the new town. Is everyone hearing that? She was wondering how they fared. Are they still mixed income? Are they still mixed race? How do you think that side of his work played out in the long term?
Well, we don't have a lot of time. Let's just take Roosevelt Island as a fascinating case. And I recommend that people go there when you're in New York, if you can ever leave your house, when you can leave your house. It's really interesting. You can still see, you can take the over the car that goes suspended, or you can take the subway, because now the subway it took a long time for the subway to get built, but it was eventually built. And you can see the old part that was built under the UDC, which was very carefully orchestrated so that there would be market rate as well as subsidized low income, moderate income. I mean, it was very diverse. And again, here I should say that it was government, it was the stipulation of the funding that the units could not be mixed in the same building. They had to be separate buildings. But one of the things the UDC did to try to make this a community of mixed income was to put small schools in different buildings so that people would mix around their children's education, and they built large apartments so that there would be families and so forth. So there's that part. When you get off the cable car, you look, that's on the left. And then when you go to the right or straight ahead, you see when all of that is collapsed. And then in the recent decade or so, market rate housing has been built on Roosevelt Island of, a very different looking. Some people might like the way it looks better because, as we have said, the part that was built by the UDC has not in all cases aged well, hasn't been properly maintained in all cases. So generally it looks pretty good, and the open spaces look fine. But you see then this, kind of very typical upscale housing. And then at the southern end of the island is the new university that Cornell is building, the tech school. And at the very tip, the FDR Memorial that finally got built. Louis Kahn, one of your guys, designed it. And then there was no money to build it. UDC collapsed and it took decades. And finally, about, I don't know, 8 years ago or something, it opened. And it's really quite stunning. But the island is an incredible document of these different moments and ambitions for what to do with an island. I think actually we're the UDC operating today and getting access to that island, they probably wouldn't have been able to densify it to the extent they did. There would be much more of a push to keeping it as open space because that was not, you know, at that moment really such a major concern. So I think it's the people. There are still, I meet people all the time people grew up in the UDC part of the island, and it's still quite viable, but it's being encroached on by the market.
Great, thank you. Thank you for bringing all these examples, and I think encouraging us to look back more closely at what has happened in the past and see how it might inform the future. So thank you, Liz. One more plug for the book.
And it's I should say that November 17th, it will be out in paperback, or it is already out, but it'll be officially published.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us, Liz. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you in the audience who joined us too. I'll applaud on
and
behalf of
thank
everyone
you for doing this with me and having me. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you. Yes,
Bye.
absolutely. Have a good night, everybody.